Hey, good day, and thanks again for tuning in to another great and exciting episode of the OIG Roundtable. I've got the full group today, so excited to have them all here. I've got Wade McFall, it depends who you're talking to on that. Wade, retired Assistant Special Agent Charge from the LA office of the OIG, now one of our senior people on one of our Medicaid contracts. Matt Kachansky, one of our fraud, waste, abuse managers, also retired senior executive from HHS OIG and retired Northeast UPIC director. And then finally, Jason Eisenrein, who is sitting in his RV somewhere he's like the Carmen of San Diego, or where is Waldo? Jason retired also like Matt, senior executive from HHS OIG, retired Western UPIC director, and our special director in charge, working on a lot of special projects here. And I am still Eric Rubenstein until someone tells me otherwise, the Senior Director of Litigation, Fraud, Waste, and Abuse. So we wanted to continue our conversations that we've been having over the past few weeks on the premise and the discussion involving SIU operations and management and sort of getting the best bang for your buck and all of the things that become operational. And we've all worked in various capacities over the years operationally with HHS and within the OIG, and then Matt and Jason having run UPICs. And for those who aren't intimately familiar with the vernacular, UPICs are really the Medicare version of an SIU is the easiest way to put it. And then obviously the biggest thing is for Matt and Jason, having been the directors of those UPICs, they're at the tip of the spear for their regions. In what their purview was, which meant that they had a large budget to manage, a large number of staff to manage, both employees and contractors, as well as the daily interaction with CMS that comes with having been in those positions. So we wanted to spend some time today talking about really three things that are going to make up the bulk of our conversation today. And that's going to be the importance of being able to vet out a lead. And by vet out a lead, I mean what makes a good lead versus a bad lead, meaning a complaint that comes in. Complaints are proactive and reactive. So we want to talk a little about that. We want to talk a little bit about how do you prioritize cases? What's important to an SIU? What is important to the operational tempo that goes with how that SIU runs? Because even the UPICs have case prioritizations that go along the way. Some of those are internal prioritizations because of where they are regionally. Some of those are prioritizations because CMS tells them that it's a prioritization. And then finally, there is a difference between an audit and an investigation, and we want to talk a little bit about what those differences are. So Wade, I want to start with you. Lead vetting is an important piece as an agent, as an investigator, as a manager, and even in your current role, being able to understand whether or not a lead is worth pursuing is an important piece. And the one thing that I always think about when I think about a lead and vetting out that lead and the value of that information, right? You've got proactive, you've got reactive, right? Proactive are going to be primarily data analytics, are going to be proactive and outliers. And proactive is going to be being able to see trends and patterns. But a lot of leads are reactive, right? A complaint comes in, a whistleblower makes a complaint. If it's a key TAM, something that comes into a plan's hotline or something along those lines. When looking at leads, and I know, you're getting leads now on the contract that you're on, you have to determine, is this something that's worth pursuing from a time perspective, that ROI that we've been talking about. But even as a supervisor, when you were at the OIG, understanding what a good lead is and a bad lead can be are going to be some of those differentiators, because it ultimately comes down to resource management. There are only so many investigators. There are only so many data analysts. There are only so many agents. What are some of the things that you would look at and let's kind of take it, through as an agent, as an ASAC, all the way up through to now? What are some of the things that give you interest in a case? Because that's also part of lead vetting, is does it have a level of, sometimes they'll call it the sexiness, but what are some of the things that you would look at to say, hey, this looks like a lead we want to do a little bit more work on, or this is a lead that we really should not be taking any time in discussing?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out the two different goals between like the OIG world and the MCO, whereas probably the main goal for agents is, and again, we kind of keep going back to this theme, but the goal is really to get criminal referrals versus recoveries. So for the proactive versus reactive, I mean, ideally, especially in the OIG world, you want to have a little of both. There's a lot of value to having a source or like an informant or somebody who can confirm like your suspicions and what you suspect the case involves. So you're really not going to get a case that's strictly based on data accepted by, the U.S. Attorney's Office or DA's office. You're going to have to be able to do that groundwork to get someone, a person, to either confirm or deny things, maybe have some kind of evidence, whether it be, explanation of benefits or whatever. But just strictly the data proactive case isn't really going to be a good referral. Now, on the other side of it, you can run data and extrapolate and basically request for an overpayment refund. But that's a different it's a completely different story than if you're working it towards a criminal referral. So that's one area. Another is how current is the data. A lot of times we get a referral that had been bounced around, and maybe the carrier or the ZPIC, UPIC, somebody looked at it for a while, and it's taken maybe a couple of years to get to my desk where I'm trying to determine if it's worth investing resources. So you have to look at is there a statute of limitations issue? Because our cases typically take a couple of years. If the activity being investigated is 3 or 4 years old, or it stopped 3 or 4 years ago, you're really going to have a limited amount that you're going to be able to look at that's still within the statute of limitations. So that's a concern. Ideally, the conduct is ongoing, so the statute of limitations really hasn't even started yet. So that's one thing as far as current versus old data. And if they're still billing, from a investigative standpoint, you have more options as far as investigative activities you can do. So that's another area. Evidentiary value is something to look at. Maybe there's issues that you have to prove, intent issues and things of that nature, that you have to look at it through the eyes of the prosecutor. And if the evidence is weak, and that goes back to not having somebody you can interview and confirm things. So that's another area to consider when you're referencing whether or not to invest resources in it. Another area is the total loss amount. It's a little bit different. The threshold, I believe, is quite a bit lower for a lot of the MCOs than it was for the OIG world. We didn't have like a published, the threshold is X amount of dollars, but and it's different in each judicial district. But in LA, I mean, we had so many cases to choose from that you really weren't investing resources in something that was, below $1 million, because we had so many cases that were much more than that. So that's definitely a consideration. Again, in the MCO world, I think there's a tendency to invest resources in things that are not going to have as much of they're not all $1 million cases. You might be working a case that's $15,000. And then I really feel like you have to look at it and say, is the resources we're investing in this, is it worth it to continue down this track? So there has to be some decisions made as far as, investing resources into those lower dollar cases. And the final thing that I would say is a consideration is you always have to look at, is there patient harm involved? If there's patient harm involved, whether it be an OIG case or a managed care Medicaid case, that kind of accelerates it, where even if the dollar amount is low, maybe the evidentiary value isn't is good, and it could be an older case where there could be a statute issue. But if there's patient harm, that really accelerates it to put it to the front of the pack, and you really have to invest in it then. Yeah,
and I'm going to go to Jaysen in a minute. We're going to talk about patient harm as a case prioritization issue. But, the couple of takeaways that I've always thought about is, first of all, vetting a case and determining whether or not you're going to do any work on it or move along from it is really subjective, right? There's a lot of subjectivity in that. I've always found that cases that have an unknown complainant with no other contact information, like, how do you know it's not sour grapes? And you have to kind of look at those with a grain of salt. When we do a lot of our SIU process improvement projects, we get asked that quite often, like, what makes a good case to investigate? versus not. And it's really a very subjective piece. The key things that I got from you that I think are really important takeaways are oftentimes the staleness of the case versus the freshness of the case is an important factor. You know, one thing for sure is, have there been instances where you're talking about that intent? Has the provider been educated previously and continued to do things or attempted to circumvent? You know, that's a key component with on the Medicare side is the TPE, the targeted probe and education, is that when you've got a provider who's gone through several rounds of TPE and has then been put on a prepay, like they've been educated, they've made an overpayment, you know, that's a strong fact, you know, in that. You know, the data analytics piece is always an inordinately important piece. And we know from historically, from the strike force, from its inception, that it's data driven. And what we know is that as time has gone on, the strike force has morphed and ebbed and flowed in the way that it obtained its cases. But, you know, early on, the strike force model was essentially based on what they called low-hanging fruit and data analytics supporting that issue. And that as that model was attempted to be exported out to other cities, it didn't always work the same way, right? So in Miami, where the address of record for a DME provider was a dirt lot, in Brooklyn, that didn't work. They were actual buildings with actual services being rendered pursuant to a kickback being paid to a lot of the patients. And there was a shift, right? So that the strike force model wasn't going to work the same way that it worked in Miami and a place like Brooklyn. So yeah, there's a lot of that. And I think that comes back to what we talked about last week, which is this premise of this push-pull on case prioritization with lead vetting. It all becomes a piece of that puzzle. You know, we find when we talk to our SIUs that we do work for and a lot of our process improvement stuff, the question of how do you vet a lead properly is always a big challenge, which then gets to the next piece of the puzzle is how do you prioritize the cases, right? The amount of fraud that's out there, NHCAA estimates that the amount of fraud in the healthcare world, the payer world, is between 3 and 10%. And I'll always say that that's only because that's the estimate of what we know, right? There's a huge number of what we don't know. And so that number is probably a lot larger. And so whereas we see, for the most part, press releases about fraud schemes that involve government payers, Medicare, Medicaid, we don't really see a lot about what happens in the commercial world with a lot of the frauds that are being committed that would fall under the federal statute of healthcare fraud, but don't include maybe a government payer. So case prioritization in the commercial world is just as important. So Jaysen, I want to go to you because Wade brought up the thing that we talk a lot about. I do a lot of presentations on this issue, and we talk about patient harm. And I always talk about the case out of Detroit, Dr. Farid Fatah, the guy who was the hematology oncology doctor who was giving chemotherapy to patients who didn't have cancer, right? And one of the side effects of chemotherapy is you can get cancer. So you're giving cancer potentially to patients who didn't have it. And that case was investigated by the entire Detroit office at the time that it happened. Within something like 72 hours, they shut the doctor down, got him arrested and charged because there was a real patient harm issue. And it was kind of all hands on deck. And that becomes like the most important thing, right? Patient harm. But outside of that, case prioritization is a huge area of importance from not just the OIG perspective, but in a limited resource perspective, the UPICs, where there's the constant push-pull on, doing data analytics, proactive work, responding to requests for information, subpoenas coming from different payers. And even from OIG, and now you're doing a lot of work with a lot of our commercial and our MCO contracts and a lot of this process improvement. How do you make some of those determinations as to what is an important case, front burner, back burner, no burner?
Well, I think you and Wade have covered it really well, and I want to keep this fresh and vibrant, so I won't repeat what you just said about the importance of patient harm. I think it's self-evident, right? Why that's important. So what I think I would first like to say is that the operational approach to case prioritization is a living process, if you will. So it doesn't work out if you just have some sort of delineated number of types of investigations or service areas that are of interest. And everything is a situation, as I like to say. So, there might be particular instances where that is relevant and important. But generally speaking, it's a process that is ongoing. So, I would suggest also there can be tools put in place so that you're capturing the effectiveness of an investigation along the way, because what starts out as something that, oh my gosh, this, the amount of money at risk here is huge. And, therefore this is a top priority investigation and we're devoting top priority resources to it. And then at some point there was an error made, or it was a miscalculation, or, it just didn't pan out, right? Because as an investigation, we're there to either prove or refute the allegations. And I think many times organizations forget about the refute part. We're all, I don't know. We all want to make that investigation work, but the reality is sometimes it doesn't. So you have to be prepared to make management decisions. And many times, the line investigators, they're so committed to that particular investigation, they may not, have that ability to see the forest through the trees, that this is not one that should be pursued. Because ultimately, the reason for prioritization is we can't work everything. We just do not have resources as organizations that allow us to work everything that comes in the door. So one other thing I'll just mention about it is that the analytical piece can help resolve a lot of these frustrations. So, as the algorithms are employed, they also are part of that living process. And it's okay to take attributes and change them out as need be to make sure that the items of interest that are popping up on the radar screen are in fact going to provide a return on investment or address those really important issues such as patient harm.
Yeah, those are important pieces. On the data analytics piece, the thing that I think that is one of the key components that sometimes is missed is the human element that needs to be there. That you've got to take that data and ensure that you don't have a false positive or a false negative. The example I give is in New Jersey, when they brought the strike force in, one of the first strike force cases that I got assigned involved a doctor in North New Jersey who was a neurologist, but was the #2 highest biller in the country for allergy testing and allergy shots. And collaterally, there was an allegation of kickbacks that she was directing her patients to go to one of 3 very specific pharmacies, and that there might have been an allegation of kickbacks. Well, at the end of the day, the information on the pharmacy stuff wound up being just a false positive. It took about a day to do the vetting, all from my desk. But what I learned was that most of the patients that were going to this particular doctor, so the doctor was of a particular cultural ethnicity, and almost all of the patients were of a same or similar culture ethnicity. So that made sense, right? You're going to go to someone that you're comfortable with from the same culture. And the patients all lived within a very small distance from the doctor's office. And it turned out that the 3 pharmacies were all within a very close proximity as well. So you have all within the same culture, and the pharmacies were owned by people of similar cultural ethnicities. So that starts to make a little bit of sense. And when you looked at the drugs, the top 5 drugs that were being dispensed by those 3 pharmacies were all about the same, right? It was the same 2 or 3 for each. So, a lot of that just didn't vet out. The doctor wound up actually getting convicted after trial on the allergy testing because that was what the fraud was. But the fact is that just being diligent for a day on the data helped to essentially create enough of a question about the fact that there was a false positive on at least where the patients were going to be able to get to that. And I know, Jaysen, you've got another appointment that you've got to get to, so I'm going to move on to Matt, in the event that we lose you because of your other appointment. And I want to get to the next piece, which is, and Jaysen started to kind of allude this, because this is a data piece of the puzzle, and it really brings kind of home this conversation, which is the importance of lead vetting, the importance of case prioritization, with the fact that there are resources that are being allocated for different things. And Matt, I want to go to you for this last piece, because you've been working with me on one of our SIU process improvement pieces. We're seeing a lot of our clients that don't do prepay. We see some that do it. There's a little bit of a difference in their prepay, their postpay, depending upon the client. But the one thing that comes up constantly in our conversations and in emails and in conversations on social media is audits versus investigations. And what I've talked about in a lot of my conversations with the provider community is, when you get a request for records from a payer, and it could be the SIU of a commercial payer, it could be the UPIC, it could be the Medicare Administrative Contractor, the MAC, that you don't treat the turning over of the records or the provision of the records, you don't treat that any differently. You still must produce the records pursuant to either statute, in-network agreement, or policy, or something. There's always something that requires the turning over of those records. So you don't treat that any differently. But what is different is really what the thrust of that request is, whether it comes from a Medicare Administrative Contractor, does it come from the payment integrity side of a commercial SIU, or is it coming from the UPIC, that there's a difference between an audit and an investigation. So I want to turn it over to you, because having obviously worked for 30 plus years and seeing these kind of granular differences, people always ask, like, well, why is there a difference, and why do I care that there's a difference?
Sure. Before I get into that, I just wanted to follow up on something Jaysen talked about, to put a little finer point on something. He talked about prioritization being a living concept, and that I couldn't agree more with that. That is absolutely true. And what, at the UPICs, and I'm sure Jaysen did the same thing, and I think at a lot of the SIUs, it's not just prioritization, it's risk. So when you prioritize something coming in, it's based on loss amount, as Wade brought out, and other factors. And you're building up the prioritization based on those factors, taking into account the risk that provider has to the program and its beneficiaries and its members. As the case progresses, that risk may be reduced based on the actions taken during the course of the investigation, whether that's a payment suspension, a prepay, whatever actions that have been taken to stop the action lowers the risk and then lowers the priority. So as the case progresses, the priority can go down, not just because it's, some of the stuff is unfounded, but it's because we've handled it, in the course of the investigation. So, in our case reviews at the UPIC, we reprioritized every case every 30 days based on the progress of the investigation itself. And then the resources then were reallocated to the cases that presented the highest risk. So just wanted to get that little fine point across. Now, between audits and investigations, there are some artificial differences we can talk about. An audit can be of a program vulnerability, of an issue, that the state or a payer might look at, because, we've got a new code, we see that it's spiking there. Let's take a look at a bunch of different providers and see why that is occurring, and see if there's some things we can put into place programmatically that can, mitigate the problem. So there's generally an audit is going to have administrative remedies, whether that's with the program itself or, taking actions against the individual providers through education, overpayment. Investigations, they tend to be, through case vetting and prioritization. These are targeted investigations of individuals or entities based on individual complaints or data mining that identifies someone or something as aberrant because of their practice. And the approach to that is to see whether or not, okay, what are they doing? What rules are they breaking? And what is the remedy, all the way toward, in wage world, the referral to law enforcement. So an investigation, the approach is different because you're going from an individual, you're looking at individuals rather than general concepts. And the remedies, the end results, the continuum goes much farther than administrative possibilities. It is, the potential for, civil and criminal prosecution and litigation. A good example of an audit would be credit balances at hospitals. Those are audit subject matters that come up every year where hospitals have to rebalance their books to make sure that everybody was paid correctly and that their balance sheets are accurate. And those are generally done audits routinely. And the result is they might have to pay some money back, or sometimes, the hospital gets money back. As opposed to a cost report investigation where the allegation is this hospital is defrauding the program by miscalculating costs purposely. And that's a illustrative difference between an audit and an investigation.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up the credit balance. We actually are working on a project right now with a particular state on credit balance audits. And it's amazing how much money is sitting with providers that have gotten overpaid, and it just kind of sits there. So it is an area of vulnerability for sure. When you talk about the difference between an audit and investigation, and the importance of audits for the purpose of identifying vulnerabilities and weaknesses, I think when people think of the OIG, they either think of law enforcement in the OIG or they think about regulatory compliance. What I think people often tend to forget is the fact that one of the OIG's responsibilities, and really any OIG's responsibility, is to ferret out and identify weaknesses within its program. So whether you're with an HHS OIG or the VA OIG or any OIG, that's part of what that job is. And what we see oftentimes is providers become the cannon fodder of an audit that's done by an OIG component, like the Office of Evaluation and Inspection, where they're really testing the program's ability to police itself and identifying that weakness. And that is really no different than the payment integrity groups of commercial payers, right? And what we're starting to see is a greater increase in communication between SIU and payment integrity. We would work on projects here where people would say, what's the difference? And I would say, well, like, how did the OIG treat it? I said, well, we didn't really think of payment integrity and SIU functions or fraud differently. We always thought about fraud, waste, and abuse in this kind of holistic fashion, that you're identifying an issue and then trying to rectify that issue, whether it be through a criminal, a civil, or an administrative case. At the end of the day, it was this kind of holistic approach. And we're starting to see that with SIUs a little bit more, that the SIU is speaking more to the payment integrity people, and the payment integrity people are speaking more to the SIU people to kind of create this, this greater kind of symbiotic relationship. But I think that, at the end of the day, I've always said to people, oh yeah, go ahead, Jaysen.
I just want to add something to the audit component, because so from someone who came from the investigation world at OIG, and then coming into to the private world, and I was the Medicaid Integrity Contract Program Director, I fast learned about the processes of audits, and the process. I think what Matt said is absolutely spot on about, a lot of times it's the outcomes that are the differences between investigations and audits. But also, I will suggest that it's also about process. So some audits have to follow either government auditing standards or generally accepted government auditing standards as codified in the yellow book of, the GAO. And so, there'll be need for provider feedback on reports and findings. There are Marquess of Queensberry rules that have to be employed depending on the type of audit that is ensuing.
Yeah, the yellow book, or the GAGIS, that the accounting people love, the GAO's accounting. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that back and forth, and I always tell our payer clients that when you get a letter requesting records, you need to produce those records regardless. The question is going to be, where is that request emanating from? Is it a request for records from the SIU? Is it a request for records from a payment integrity perspective? That sometimes can give you a little bit of purview as to where in the mix you are. And I always talk about specifically when an OIG subpoena is issued, knowing who the person is that's signing that subpoena can go a long way. If the person who's signing that subpoena's title is special agent in charge, that is a little bit different than if it's the regional inspector general for the Office of Evaluation and Inspections. That if you're getting a subpoena for records from someone from the OIG's Office of Evaluation and Inspections, or even Office of Audit Services, but certainly from OE&I, that you're more likely caught up in a CMS-related CMS-related review. Whereas if you're getting a subpoena from the Office of Investigations special agent in charge, that there's an investigation going on. Now, whether you're a witness or not is another story, but the records still need to be produced. It's all a matter of just understanding, is this leading to something or not? So a lot of information, SIUs, I think as we start to progress through working with SIUs more and more, they are very complex machines. Matt and Jaysen and Wade, Matt and Jaysen, you certainly know from leading that, and Matt and Wade, being inside one now, you're seeing the absolute complexities of it and that continued need to understand where these areas are going to help with process improvement, return on investment, tangible and intangible. I always think that there is a huge intangible return on investment in stopping fraud, but also in good management of resources, that the return on investment is also in how the people are functioning and how they're able to do their job. So there's a lot. We're going to continue these conversations. In the next few weeks, we've got some great guests coming on. We're going to have someone who I think is a foremost authority in the world of fraud, waste, abuse, and podiatry, a podiatrist who worked for some of the payers for about 30 years, was intrinsically involved in the very first criminal trial that I had following the tragedies of 9/11. I had a trial involving a podiatry practice called Jamaica Foot Care that went to trial in the spring of 2002. And I'm going to be having one of the commercial payers experts on to talk about that as a fraud, some fraud schemes. We're going to have somebody on in a few weeks to talk about DME fraud. We've got a lot of great stuff coming on where we're really going to sort of involve these subject matter experts, very granular experts, in how that intertwines with SIU management, operations, and process improvement. So as always, I'm glad to have you guys on with me. I enjoy spending this time and learning from all of you when we speak. Again, our newsletter, you got to get the newsletter to get a lot of this stuff. The newsletter you can get by sending us an email at hello, HELLO, at Advize, ADVIZE Health.com. We're going to have some good LinkedIn Lives coming up soon. We continue to grow and expand our footprint. If there are any particular topics anybody is interested in hearing us pontificate about, please feel free to let us know. Again, thanks again, and we'll see you on the next OIG Roundtable.
Thanks.
Thank you all.